Last week, the Taoiseach told the Dáil that he had instructed his officials to bring forward legislative proposals to abolish the triple lock neutrality protection without delay. It's a term that stuck with me because the Taoiseach doesn't use the term without delay too often. In fact, whenever I ask the Minister for updates on capital investment for the Defence Forces, or the implementation of the Working Time Directive, or other measures that might address the retention and recruitment crisis within our Defence Forces, I am met with excuse after excuse for each year that passes. Under the Taoiseach's watch, more people are leaving the Defence Forces than are joining, but nothing can be done quickly, he tells us, to address it. Not so with the core policy that underpins our neutrality and foreign policy. That can be waived without delay. And why is that? And perhaps one of the government ministers before us tonight will finally tell us what overseas mission or missions that they want to send Irish troops to from which they're currently prevented. What is the rush? And do they accept that the Irish people have a right to know, especially as this move is happening at the exact same time as government is withdrawing the Defence Forces from an important UN-mandated peacekeeping mission, one for which our soldiers have earned high praise and commendation in the Golan Heights in Syria. So on the one hand, Irish soldiers are being withdrawn from a UN mission of value, not at the behest of the Russians or the Chinese, but at your insistence. And on the other hand, government wants to change the rules so that Irish soldiers can be sent on other missions that we don't know what they are, that don't have a UN mandate. I want to say, Laskin Corla, it's entirely legitimate for an argument for someone to present that we should abandon the triple lock neutrality protection. It's one that I fundamentally disagree with, but people are entitled to make that argument. But they're not entitled to mislead or pretend somehow that such a move wouldn't bring us beyond neutrality and that it wouldn't allow a government to shift the premise of Irish foreign policy from conflict resolution to conflict participation. And how do we know that? It's because Fine Gael told us. 20 years ago, Laskin Corla, Fine Gael were upfront and stark in their intentions. They produced a document called blatantly Beyond Neutrality, which very clearly set out that party's ambition to abandon Irish neutrality and Ireland's independent foreign policy. And key to the proposal in this document was abolishing the triple lock. Now, as it happened, their proposals were quietly dropped, albeit some were later adopted by stealth, but they were dropped for three reasons. The first is that it was very clear that the Irish people vehemently opposed the trajectory. Secondly, Fianna Fáil at least presented some optics of principle, and we had Fianna Fáil leaders, including the Taoiseach, while in opposition, who called out the proposed move to move away from the triple lock neutrality protection as, I quote, nothing more than an out-of-touch ideological obsession on the part of Fine Gael, which ignores the facts of Ireland's international standing. And thirdly, of course, the triple lock became a central guarantee to securing support of Irish voters to ratify the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. And for a while at least, governments knew that any suggestion of removing this neutrality protection would be a gross betrayal of the mandate that they'd sought and secured in that vote. Now, last week's speech by the Taoiseach could have been taken directly from this Fine Gael document of 2003. The same old arguments made 20 years ago with the additional cynical cloak of manipulating recent events in Ukraine as a guide to implement what is a 2 decades old Fine Gael policy platform. Interestingly, the Fine Gael document had a term for the approach of Micheál Martin's party. It said, and this is a direct quote, "The nod and wink approach of the Fianna Fáil government on Partnership for Peace cannot be allowed to be a precedent to be followed. It is no surprise that the public is suspicious when we have a government committed to hiding the reality of discussions at EU level on new security arrangements." It also said, "The underhand way of managing such an important aspect of Ireland's foreign policy cannot be allowed to continue." But, Laskin Corla, continue it did. 20 years later, Fianna Fáil under Micheál Martin have become unrecognisable from Fine Gael. They have adopted hook, line and sinker a Fine Gael foreign policy position that they know the Irish people don't support. And in return, Fine Gael have adopted the Fianna Fáil nod and wink approach by together bringing this motion forward in the most underhand, duplicitous, dishonest manner imaginable, by pretending that this is about sovereignty, standing up to the Russians, when in actual fact this is a proposal is about undoing decades-long neutrality and independent foreign policy. And my appeal, Laskin Corla, to the government is to be upfront in what you are proposing, and then be honourable enough to let the people have their say.
First of all, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome home the highly trained peacekeepers of the 122nd Infantry Battalion who returned from South Lebanon at the weekend. It was genuinely uplifting to see their families welcoming them home, and I wish them all the best, and to the 123rd Battalion who are rotating in this most dangerous time in the Middle East for decades, while the EU gives full support to the slaughter of Palestinian people and smugly and brazenly continues to justify that mass slaughter as defence. The Taoiseach's decision to tinker with and get rid of the triple lock is the wrong one. I see it as part of your ambition to weaken and eventually jettison our neutrality. But no way, and no matter how much tinkering the Taoiseach does, the majority of people are still intent on being militarily neutral, because they know it is a strength and not a weakness. They know it is a value and not an embarrassment. So if there are any changes to the triple lock, it must be the people who decide, not the government and your hawkish supporters. While we respect our partners and allies are entitled to their opinions, we are mature enough and serious enough to keep our own stance and our own views. And I would say this: if there is one word now that signifies why Ireland needs to keep its independent voice and position in foreign policy, that word is Gaza. By tinkering with the triple lock, you quieten that voice and dilute our military neutrality. In short, you could turn our proud peacekeepers into active participants in a conflict. Perhaps on the very side of partners and allies who have spent the last 50 days not just excusing and facilitating genocide, but actually arming it. The Taoiseach already got his answer from our defence forces when he withdrew our UNIFIL peacekeepers from the Golan Heights in order to prioritise his pet project of an EU battle group. Only 35 signed up for it. What will it take for the Taoiseach to see that Irish soldiers, just like the Irish people, want to keep the peace and they don't want to be fighting other people's wars? Instead of pushing them into war, we need to resource them, pay them, value them to do the jobs they want to do and need to do, protecting our skies and cyberspace. On the triple lock and neutrality, heed the majority and work for them, not for anyone else. This will need a referendum.
Maigad agus is mór ag muintir na héireann ar neodracht agus an seaartain seo háte dógar an taiste go bhfuil se chun jeú ar na léadú a dhéanamh le neodracht le jeú a thar leis an glas tríra atá ágainn leis an UN agus churann Sinn Féin gunne seo is leidrachtaí ar neodracht agus bethóir í a chasann. The Irish people, Minister, cherish our neutrality. It's a policy and principle that has enhanced our reputation. It has provided a platform for Ireland to promote peace, to resolve conflict and to pursue justice in international affairs. And in a world that grows more uncertain, more polarised and more dangerous, our neutrality is more important than ever. Last week, the Taoiseach announced his intention for the government to remove the triple lock, a keystone of our military neutrality. And this is a significant and regrettable U-turn by the leader of Fianna Fáil. When Fine Gael sought to undermine our neutrality, the Taoiseach rightly said that there was no reason whatsoever to change our policy on neutrality. Such a change, he said, would contribute nothing to international peace. Instead, he said that Fine Gael should acknowledge that what we have achieved because of our neutrality and set out a policy to strengthen it rather than undermine it. The Taoiseach even said that the argument which claimed that the triple lock allowed certain members of the UN Security Council to have a veto on our peacekeeping activities was, and I quote, nothing more than an out-of-touch ideological obsession. He said that it ignored the facts of Ireland's international standing, and those arguments that he made still remain valid, and he should listen to his former self. But the Taoiseach and Fianna Fáil's position has dramatically changed, and there are no grounds whatsoever to undermine our neutrality, and that's what he's planning to do by scrapping the triple lock. If the Taoiseach is to push down the accelerator and undermine Irish neutrality following his and his party's U-turn, then he needs to come clean. He needs to tell us, he needs to tell the Irish people where he would deploy Irish troops that is not part of a UN peacekeeping mission. And maybe the Minister opposite would answer that question, but I expect that he won't, because they do not want to show the real hand, the real agenda here. Because the real problem with our defence policy is the fact that our defence forces are under-resourced, underpaid. So this motion before us by Deputy Carthy calls for the Government to enshrine neutrality in the Constitution, to refer any proposed changes on neutrality, including the triple lock, to the people in a referendum, and most importantly to adequately fund and support our defence forces who serve us so well.
Over 3 minutes.
Cormagats, as one of those who campaigned very strongly at the time of both the Nice Treaty and then later on the Lisbon Treaty, but in particular on the Nice Treaty, when the government produced the second attempt to try and pass it, when they produced the Seville Declaration, the triple lock, which we now know it as, we said at the time that this was just trickery by the government and those who wanted a yes vote. And we've been proven right. You waited and waited until this opportunity. We all knew at the time that you had no interest in ensuring that neutrality was protected. You have voted down every attempt in this chamber by myself and others to ensure that neutrality would be included or endorsed by the Irish people at a referendum and included in our constitution, because you have no and never had an intention to uphold neutrality. It's interesting that Micheál Martin, the man who announced the latest reversal, was in government at the time when Fianna Fáil endorsed and joined the Partnership for Peace, a NATO organisation. It's very appropriate that NATO on manoeuvres in Cork in recent days. There is a whole history of Fianna Fáil governments. We've heard what Fine Gael governments want to do, but Fianna Fáil governments have wanted to do since they've been in office. There's a whole series of erosion of the standing of Ireland. I don't know what genius thought up that this is the time to undermine one of the key reasons why we have such a standing in the world, that we are respected around the world, because we are seen as honest brokers, because we are seen as neutral, that we are seen and respected because of our peacekeepers around the world and the job that they have done. Yet, some genius called Micheál Martin thinks it's appropriate now to start to unravel that neutrality and all the goodwill that our neutrality has created throughout the world.
There are 2 speakers left. The
question I'm wondering is, will the Minister answer the straight question? Will the Minister answer the simple question, what missions does this government wish to involve the state in that is not currently permitted to do so? If we are going peacekeeping and we're not going peacekeeping with the UN, then who are we going peacekeeping with? Will the Minister answer that question? I have to say I suspect not. Perhaps he'd surprise me. But I think that question will be asked dozens upon dozens of times this evening, and I don't think we'll get any closer to a straight answer. We will get a great deal. I think we will get a great deal of partisan polemic, ostensibly high-minded, but when it comes down to it, no real substance in it, no real meaning. I think we will get imagined concoctions of the foreign policies that a variety of opposition parties will have to try and distract from the fact that ultimately the Minister and the Government will refuse to answer the question, what missions do they intend to deploy Irish troops in outside of UN structures? What are they? Because I certainly haven't got any clarity on that, and I don't think that they intend to provide it. The fact is, we are a small state. We will never be a significant military power. The credibility that we have internationally which is well established and well proven by the fact that we recently occupied a prominent position on the Security Council, is because of our diplomatic weight, because we have preserved our status as a neutral state. Tugann sé cúig doing I bhfad níos mó ná dá mbeadh míad páirteach in éon gníomh míleata den tais atá táim den túram go bhfuil roinnt den rialtas a géirí go mbeimish déanamh. The fact is, if the Minister is serious about supporting our defence forces, they should ensure that they have the resources to fully participate in the missions that they are already committed to, that they have been weakened in doing so, and that they ensure the welfare and decent pay and conditions of our defence forces, whether in Collins Barracks or Hall Bolan or the Lebanon or anywhere else for that matter. That is where our focus should be, on preserving our international status. There is no question in my mind that this Act has undermined our neutrality and has undermined the basis on which Irish people voted in prior referendums and the multiple commitments that were given by previous governments in relation to that.
Am I the last speaker?
You're the last speaker.
Okay, arguably one of Ireland's greatest foreign policy achievements were the so-called Irish resolutions at the UN, and these are widely recognised as having brought about the first nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And Ireland was, of course, the first country to sign it. Frank Aiken, who was then Fianna Fáil's Minister for External Affairs, was under no illusion. He recognised and stated explicitly that it was our neutrality that was key to this. Our neutrality was not simply a side effect of a state that was a former colony. Neutrality was at the forefront of a positive and constructive foreign affairs strategy. It's what allowed us to play the role of an honest broker for that treaty. Now, I always knew that Fine Gael wasn't keen on our neutrality, and to be fair to them, they were always open in relation to this. But I have to say I thought that Fianna Fáil, at least when it came to the issue of neutrality, were different. But I was wrong. And when the Taoiseach previously said that he would defend the triple lock, I naively thought he would be true to his word, but again, I was wrong. This effort to whittle down our neutrality through 1,000 cuts is there for all to see. And it is absolutely insulting to the intelligence of the Irish people to tell us that our eyes are lying to us. It is an insult to say that all the NATO partnerships that have been entered into aren't part of a long-term project to get on board. Agus Ara, you and the Taoiseach could have put this to the referendum if you wanted to do the decent thing. Instead, you're trying to smuggle through customs this effort to get us into this through the back door. And a Sinn Féin government would look to enshrine our neutrality in the Constitution. We would look to leverage our neutrality as part of a positive foreign policy which places peace and diplomacy at the forefront, rather than outsourcing our military decision-making to larger powers. And now is the time, Ara, to strengthen our neutrality and not abandon it. Ara, tan cumar an scéal gúil an Taoiseach nóirí marall ar an policy nódroch atá an. Agus camar rá gur hiame gur Fianna Fáil agus gur an Taoiseach I bhábhar an policy nódrochas atá an a go méid atá feici am le rins míon í anús tá cuma omláin difriúil ar an scéal. Tá nódrochas mar chuid lárnach, mar chrílár gin policy grachaí achtracha atá an sa stáit seo. Agus tá an ar fad go greideann an bobal in our nódrochas. Agus fiú nuair bhí na fórum sin ar siúl agé sé ag an rialtas seo agus ag an Taoiseach agus nuair thuaidh sé chuig ceantrachaí éagsúil chuig carchaí éagsúil nuair tháinig sé go Gaile. Bhí sé soléir a Ara. Nuair thuaidh sé chuig carcaí, bhí sé soléir a Ara. Go rá foran na nína I bhábhar an policy nódroch atá an agus fecin muid fiús na pobal brethna go bhfuil an takeíocht go bhfuil takeíocht an phobal leis an nódrochas agus tá sé fíorthábhachtach go ndéanamh muid sin a chosint. Tá ról agus bhí ról láidir an go héidir náisiúnta marall an follasí nóideacha tá sé Sinn Féin I Jeremy na náisiún aontaithe fiú le garid inús. Ach mar a dúirt mo chóghlachaí an 7 crónin an sin, tá sé feici an a rístelle. Nor bhecin muid a méidir tá torlú in Gaza faoi láir, nor méidir tá torlú sa Palestine, cé chó tábhachtach is atá se go bhfuil go láidir nóideach an ag an stáit seo as ba chóirún cholathairtaíine chuna sin a chosint.
Gur má go dtí seachta agus inis an rialtas an Tara Peterfer.
Thank you, Lascan Corla. I'm glad to have the opportunity to address this important topic in the House this evening and move the government counter-motion. In the course of my remarks, I would like to first clarify what Ireland's policy of military neutrality is. Secondly, I wish to recall the findings of the recently publicised report on the Consultative Forum on International Security Policy. And finally, I will set out the proposals made by the Taoiseach last week in the Dáil in relation to the triple lock. It is important that discussions on matters as important and sensitive as these proceed from a basis of fact, which is why I begin by defining our current policy. Ireland's policy of military neutrality, as practised by successive governments over many decades, means Ireland does not participate in military alliances or common or mutual defence arrangements. Let me be very clear on this. The government has no plans to alter this policy. I, as Minister, value and hold dear our neutrality and would not undermine it. It goes without saying that military neutrality does not mean that we either wish or can isolate ourselves from the challenging security environment we find ourselves in today. Nor does it mean that we can ignore our responsibilities towards our own citizens or other international partners. The changed geopolitical context and wider threat environment in Europe calls for a serious consideration of the state's approach to international security issues. It was in this context that the Taoiseach convened the Consultative Forum on International Security Policy, which took place in June. The forum discussed these issues in a wider foreign policy context, including Ireland's work to protect the rules-based international order and the lessons learned from our UN Security Council membership. The chairperson of the forum, Professor Louise Richardson, recently submitted a report which provides an overview of these discussions and the public consultation. Professor Richardson's report is clear that there is a strong degree of consensus on many aspects of Ireland's international engagement. This is important. It is too easy to highlight divisions, encourage polarisation and play politics with foreign security and defence force policy issues. Too easy, and in the context of recent events, all too dangerous. Across the world, including here in Ireland, instances of hate speech, disinformation, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism have been increasing, especially online. We have all too clearly seen how this can spill over to deadly effect. In that context, it is positive to note that we are all in agreement that Ireland should continue to be active in the maintenance of international peace and security by supporting the global multilateral system with the UN Charter at its heart, and by continuing to vocally defend international law, particularly international humanitarian law and human rights. Nobody can question the pride we feel as Irish people all over the world in our role in international peacekeeping, or the fact that there is a palpable desire to sustain and build on Ireland's role on the global stage. There is also a recognition that we face a new and emerging threat, including in the areas of cyber and maritime security. Furthermore, there was a clear consensus in favour of greater investment in the defence forces. The government is deeply committed to the positive transformation of our defence forces into a modern, agile military force capable of responding to increasingly complex security threats. It was in this context that the Taoiseach addressed the ongoing work to transform the defence forces through the detailed implementation plan and the report of the Commission on the Defence Forces, which was published last week. The plan sets out the steps being taken towards a once-in-a-generation transformation of the Defence Forces through a commitment to move to level of ambition 2 with a commensurate increase of the department budget from €1.1 billion to €1.5 billion in 2022 prices by 2028. This is part of our ongoing investment in our defence forces, in its people, infrastructure, capabilities and culture. The Taoiseach also addressed a range of measures relating to our national security, arrangements including commitment by the Government to deliver a national security strategy in the coming months. It is clear to me that this renewed focus on our core national security interests has rapidly become essential in an increasingly complex and contested world. Alas, Ceann Comhairle, in the view of the Government, the motion we are discussing today does not serve to enhance the proactive international role that we all wish to see Ireland play in such complex situations. While ostensibly supportive of our international engagement, the motion, if agreed, would in fact serve to curtail Ireland's efforts to contribute to international peace and security, rather than in any way enhance them. In particular, the Government would have a real concern about the proposal to hold a referendum enshrining neutrality in the Constitution. We do not believe that this would be appropriate or responsible course of action. The policy of military neutrality has always been a deliberate policy choice on the part of successive governments since the Second World War. As we repeatedly set out, the Government has no intention to alter this policy. That does not mean, however, we cannot and should not continue to discuss our international security policy and the choices we face. We need to look honestly at the challenges to our international engagement. It is the Government's clear view that we cannot ignore the systematic challenges facing the UN Security Council. In many of the worst crises internationally, where rapid, impartial and decisive international action is desperately needed, the Council is unwilling or unable to act. To recall our current position in Irish legislation, the dispatch of contingents of the Defence Forces for overseas peace support operations may only take place where the deployment is approved by the Government, approved by Dáil resolution if proposed deployment is more than 12 personnel, and that the operation in question is mandated and authorised by the UN. Under this system, this triple lock system effectively gives a veto to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council over our national sovereign decision to deploy troops to peacekeeping missions as we see fit. Why would we wish to curtail our own independent decision-making? Whose interest does this serve? In the course of his remarks during last week's Dáil debate on the Consultative Forum on International Security Policy, the Taoiseach stated that it would make sense to amend our existing legislation in a manner that would allow us to respond to crisis situations with more agility and where, in making these important decisions, we were not surrendering our sovereignty. Work on the preparation of those legislative proposals will commence immediately, with a view to proposals being brought before the Government in due course. Of course, any legislative proposals will remain fully consistent with the principles of the UN Charter and international law. They will also be debated and approved by the Dáil and Seanad, thus providing the Oireachtas with ample opportunity to debate this important initiative. Not only does the motion put forward by Sinn Féin fail to adequately address the challenging international security context in which we now operate, it also erroneously equates any amendment to the triple lock with a change to the long-standing policy of military neutrality, which this Government has been clear that it has no intention of altering. As the Taoiseach said last week, this is simply not on the agenda. It is also abundantly clear that Ireland's policy of military neutrality is respected by our fellow member states, and the protocols attached to the Lisbon Treaty continue to fully reflect this. Ceann Comhairle, the House needs no reminder of the increasingly volatile and challenging times in which we find ourselves. We have ample opportunity in this House to debate the impact of Russia's appalling invasion of Ukraine and the dreadful situation in the Middle East. Throughout these and all other challenges to global peace and security, Ireland's commitment to multilateralism, the rules-based international order, with the UN Charter at its core, is the cornerstone of our foreign policy. This will remain our strong and consistent message throughout this and all crises. It is in recognition of this complexity that the Government now presents proposals for change. We simply cannot afford to isolate ourselves or to ignore our responsibilities towards either our own citizens, our fellow EU member states, or other friendly partners. Instead of opening a serious discussion of the threat environment and our capabilities, I am concerned that the motion before us simply attempts to reduce these conversations to a political debate. This is in the context in which the Government opposes the motion. The Government's counter-motion reiterates our support for Ireland's long-standing policy of military neutrality. our commitment to continuing international engagement and the ongoing positive transformation of the Defence Forces. At the same time, it reflects our desire for a modern, fit-for-purpose foreign security and defence policy, in keeping with the challenges we face today. And in this light, I call on the House to support the counter-motion. Garv Mahagat.
Minister Burke. We now go to Deputy Quinlivan, sharing with Deputies Ryan, Mythen, Donnelly and Stanley.
2 minutes each, Minister, the neutrality of the Irish state has served us and the globe very well. Our neutrality is the most fundamental part of our foreign policy, and a key aspect of that is the checks the triple lock system imposes on our Defence Forces' ability to operate outside of the state. The Taoiseach is attempting to undo this. He is attempting to radically change our approach to foreign policy for the worst. In opposition, he said that the triple lock was a necessity, yet last week he said he wants to do away with it. He was right then, and he's wrong now. Irish Defence Forces are respected across the globe. State actors and non-state actors both respect them. We have tragically lost members of our Defence Forces to both types of groupings, but they are generally able to operate where aligned troops would not be able to do so. It is because of our neutrality, it is because of the checks and balances that constrain our ability to deploy those troops abroad that aids our forces in the delivery of their humanitarian missions from the Lebanon to the African continent. Changing this will be a grave mistake that will undermine the ability to operate where others cannot operate. Now we are all used to Fianna Fáil breaking their election promises. We are used to their members speaking out of both sides of their mouth, and as such, it is no surprise to see their party leaders so blatantly go back to the commitments made in their 2020 general election manifesto regarding the triple lock system. Last week, the Taoiseach said the triple lock needs to be ended, but his party manifesto said something different. Fianna Fáil reaffirms its commitment to the retention of the triple lock of the UN mandate and authorisation government and Dáil approval prior to committing Defence Forces personnel as overseas service. Taoiseach, our Minister, in both the Nice and Lisbon referendums, I campaigned in both of them against them for the reasons of my concerns about our neutrality being eroded. We were promised under the Seville Declaration that they would be protected, but the Taoiseach seeks to undo that. So the guarantees were offered to ensure that the treaties were passed a second time, and they were added. Now the Fianna Fáil leader, following a vote of Fianna Fáil Ardèche of 2022, is committed to removing this mechanism that has served us so well in the past.
Ryan.
This government stated its intention to legislate to remove the triple lock and the protection it affords our Defence Forces members beggars belief. Since 1958, Ireland's Defence Forces have proudly fulfilled their peacekeeper roles, a proud, unbroken peacekeeping service record, from the Congo to Kosovo, Mali and more, to the present-day UNIFIL forces in Lebanon and to the UNDOF forces in the Golan Heights. Each and every member committed and proud to serve as peacekeepers, backed by the Irish people, crucially a United Nations mandate. However, Minister, you and your government seem hell-bent on tearing up that proud peacekeeping record, upending Irish neutrality and turning our peacekeepers into conflict participants. Without the UN peacekeeping mandate, God alone knows where our troops could end up. Perhaps you, Minister, could enlighten us, or maybe the Taoiseach, if he was here, would enlighten us. Our neutrality in our strength recognised the world over. The triple lock is at the core of this, and any attempt to undermine or change that must be strongly resisted. In fact, Minister, you might benefit from some mature recollection at this point, when, in opposition, the Taoiseach stated that the triple lock was a necessity. What changed his mind in the meantime? Maybe you could tell us that. In fact, it is blindingly obvious that not only has this government abandoned our neutrality, they have effectively abandoned our Defence Forces. Chronic underinvestment has meant they are underfunded, under-resourced and definitely underpaid. Time to call a halt on the Fine Gael Fianna Fáil agenda to undermine our Defence Forces and our neutrality. Time for Sinn Féin in government who would properly fund our Defence Forces so they can continue our peacekeeping, our proud peacekeeping participation record and other vital protective duties for the Irish people. I call in this House to reject the government's shameful attempts to undermine Ireland's neutrality, keep our peacekeepers as peacekeepers and fully support Sinn Féin's motion to properly fund and resource our Defence Forces.
Deputy Mythen.
Irish neutrality is and will be undermined by the removal of the triple lock and the changing of legislation on the dispatch of Defence Force personnel overseas. The government's language in U-turn on military neutrality is not keeping faith with the Seville Declaration, which states for Ireland to participate in any military operations overseas, it must have authorisation by the Security Council or General Assembly, agreement of the Irish Government and approvals of Dáil. These three stipulations are the very foundation that gives Ireland and the Irish people their unique neutrality identity, their world credibility and the ability to shape things around diplomacy. and fortifies our participation in peacekeeping missions. More importantly, it is woven into the fabric of our sovereignty as an independent nation. We must listen to the government. We have listened to the government arguments about removing the triple lock. They cite the recent cyber attack by the Russian criminal gang on the HSE as one of the rational reasons to opt out of the triple lock, when in fact the HSE IT system is antiquated and has been upgraded or been underinvested for the last 20 years. The site the world is evolving in a different global direction. This was always the way. There will always be global tension in different parts of the world. Therefore, we must cherish and protect our neutrality and keep it intact. The voice of people must always be present and not be drowned out by the thunder of militarisation and the lobbyists for lethal weapons and the lucrative arms industry. Irish troops on peacekeeping missions are respected the world over. To allow our troops to be deployed as conflict participants will make both Ireland and themselves a target by the countries they will be sent to fight against. It would automatically tarnish our reputation as a well-respected peacekeeping force, in fact the longest unbroken record of any nation in the world. It will have repercussions on all our diaspora living in many countries abroad. It will have the potential to affect negatively any citizen travelling abroad on an Irish passport. We must ensure that any deployment of Irish Defence Forces or security personnel on overseas missions be accompanied with a full mandate from the United Nations. We must trust and put our faith in the Irish people and give them the final say on neutrality through a referendum to enshrine the principle of neutrality in our Constitution, and never rely on any government to make that decision or not. We must formally establish a Citizens' Assembly on the question of neutrality. Last but not least, pay a decent wage to our Irish Defence Forces. It's a scandal to think that a substantial number of our Defence Forces are on working family payments. A recent report on the Commission on the Future of the Defence Force declared that there is a need for 246 million of investment annually to bring them to a modern-day standard. No one has the right to diminish or deconstruct our neutrality. This can only be done by the full consent and will of the sovereign Irish people through a referendum. Please support this motion.
Deputy Donnelly.
I'd like to claim that I wrote the following words, but I didn't. These are the words of the Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, and I quote, "It's been reported that the Government is about to publish a green paper prepared by Minister Shatter, which proposed that Ireland loosens the triple lock in relation to overseas military engagements. This is happening just as the final countries are formally enacting the Lisbon measures, which explicitly addresses concerns on this matter. It appears that Fine Gael is arguing that Ireland is failing in its responsibilities and that we are allowing Russia and China to have a veto over their peacekeeping activities. There is nothing more out of touch ideological obsession on the part of Fine Gael, which ignores the facts of violence. International standing few countries in the world are held anywhere near the esteem that there is for Ireland because of how often we participate in peacekeeping and the wonderful work of our soldiers and Gardaí. We do not enter these missions easily, but we do so wholeheartedly and with real impact. The current policy works it to complete popular legitimacy. There is no reason whatsoever to change it. It will impress no one in Europe and will contribute nothing to international peace. Instead of sniping at our neutrality, the government should acknowledge what we have achieved because of it and set out a policy to strengthen it, not undermine it. Now, I'll ask people to listen to Micheál Martin's words last week and the flip-flop Taoiseach, and I wonder why he would make such a massive change in his policy. I think he should stand by his words of 2013.
Stanley.
Our position on neutrality is long held and is cherished and valued by the Irish Public Minister. Neutrality has provided our state with credibility, impartiality, to be a voice for peace and de-escalation of armed conflict, and any attempts to weaken our neutrality or drag Ireland towards a military alliance must be strongly opposed. In fact, I have not heard one convincing or valid argument for a change in the triple lock system. I've heard bogus ones, all right. For such a significant change to our neutrality policy, I would expect to be presented with substantial evidence that there is some sort of urgent problem. Russia's veto on the Security Council has been meekly suggested. However, as has been said already, in 2013, Micheál Martin himself stated that this argument was, and I quote, out of touch ideological obsession, unquote. But of course he's done a somersault now that he's swanning around Europe. So what's changed the Taoiseach's mind? What's changed his mind since the Fianna Fáil manifesto in 2020, when they said they would protect the triple lock and neutrality? As far as I'm concerned, Micheál Martin happens to be correct in 2013, and their position in 2020, on paper at least, was okay as well. But since then he's done a somersault. So whenever this matter is raised by the militarists and the elite in this state, those that oppose ending neutrality, I'm one of those, those who oppose mending neutrality. I'm always suspicious of the motivation. But we all know that it won't be their sons and daughters, the sons and daughters of the elite, that are sent out to the front line to fight in conflicts. It'll always be the working class who are sent out to the front lines. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael pushing this, you have lied to the Irish public during the debates. And I remember my campaign during both of those, during the Nice and Lisbon Treaty, when you told us not to worry about neutrality. We were scaremongering. The triple lock system would protect us. And that convinced a lot of people, because if you remember, you had to make 2 runs at it to get it through. And that's what convinced a lot of Irish people to go ahead and back it. Now you're saying that being fooled. You're prepared to stand here tonight and tell the Irish people that you fooled them. That's why we need a constitutional amendment to enshrine neutrality in our constitution. Ceann Comhairle. Thank you very much.
Minister, we have a long and proud tradition of supporting United Nations peacekeeping missions. Ireland is the only state to have continuous deployment on UN and UN-mandated peace operations since 1958, and we should be immensely proud of that commitment to peace and stability. We should stand fully opposed to any attempts to undermine our highly respected standing on the international stage. Where we are known as a voice for peace and justice, we should be developing our soft power, our diplomatic corps, and developing and enhancing our neutrality. While Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and the Greens might be happy to chip away at our neutrality, it is clear that the Irish people stand firmly opposed to it. The Irish people stand firmly supportive of Irish neutrality. And I'd be interested to hear these parties, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens, outline where they see Irish troops being sent. If not on a UN peacekeeping mission, where will the Irish go, Minister? Off to prop up some NATO intervention? Should Irish men and women be sent off to put their lives on the line to fulfil the militarist agenda? An agenda that is being pushed so hard by growing elements within the EU. The EU has shown repeatedly to be happy to do business with rogue states. States such as apartheid Israel, who show no respect for international law. A state that doesn't even hide the brutal crimes it commits. A state that murders thousands of children in the Gaza Strip. And yet this government are telling us that we should send Irish troops to conflict zones selected by the EU. We should be standing firmly by our commitment to United Nations peacekeeping missions and not following the militarist line. Ireland must come to the fore in the EU and pull the EU back to a line of peace, justice and respect.
The
Taoiseach Micheál Martin is not renowned for his speed and action on any issues. But the triple lock is to be dropped without delay, we're told. And strangely, he only said last November that he didn't believe in removing it. Thankfully, opinion polls suggest Irish people get it and treasure our heritage as a neutral country. And when it's been tested by EU treaties in the past, those treaties have been rejected until assurances have been given that neutrality would remain. Now this government wants to bin those assurances, despite their own manifesto commitments to neutrality and the triple lock. The world needs more honest brokers like a neutral Ireland. We've never been a coloniser, we've never invaded another country, and are respected as peacekeepers and peacemakers. We've experienced conflict and division on our own island and have practical experience of building peace. And this has allowed us to do vital work, including nuclear non-proliferation, disarmament and humanitarianism. The Good Friday Agreement, the peace process, is a positive example to all those seeking an end to intractable conflicts. So being neutral does not mean we refuse to choose a side. It means we choose the side of human rights, of peace, and not with those who would wage war on innocent civilians. And it's not good enough for the government would use the Irish Defence Forces as a political bargaining chip when they've singularly failed to address the very serious problem in retention and recruitment that the Army, the Navy and the Air Corps have been experienced for decades now. The Irish Defence Forces are 2,000 members under what is considered the most basic requirement and 4,000 under what it should be fully operational. So we're struggling to fill our regulations in relation to current UN missions. We should not diminish our status as a UN peace commission. So any change to Ireland's neutral status, particularly the removal of triple lock, has to go to a referendum.
Minister, there's no doubt that many people here and across the country were stunned when last week the Taoiseach and Minister for Foreign Affairs announced his intention to abolish the triple lock. I'm sure that many of the Taoiseach's own party members were also shocked at the revelation, given that the Fianna Fáil 2020 general election manifesto gave a commitment to fully maintaining neutrality and the triple lock. There are some in the Taoiseach's is a case in point who seek to dismiss the concerns we've raised about this decision and the reasons for our opposition to this move. And when I speak about opposition to this move, I'm speaking in light of the commitment to the triple lock as outlined in the National Declaration contained within the Irish Guarantee on the Lisbon Treaty, the Civil Declaration on the Treaty of Nice ahead of Nice II referendum, and the programme for government. Yet the Taoiseach effectively believes our neutrality poses such a weakness that his view should override those obligations and commitments to the people of this country. The gradual shift away from our neutrality is something that we in Sinn Féin have warned about, and the announcement made in this House last week saw that shift ramp up a level, with the Taoiseach beginning his attempt to ram through a fundamental shift in Irish foreign policy and a further lurch in the Fine Gael direction of Fianna Fáil. The Minister appears to now consider our neutrality as being a weakness, given his current intentions to undermine it. So if he wants to pursue his goal of undermining our neutrality, then he should put it to the people in a referendum and let the people decide. Neutrality is not a weakness, it is our strength. Any weakness is evident in our government and its commitment to adequately funding our defence forces. This underfunding and under-resourcing needs to be addressed to allow Ireland to continue to participate in UN peacekeeping missions, to defend and monitor our skies and seas and protect Ireland from the real threats we face, including cyber attacks.
I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Roger Cole of the Peace and Neutrality Alliance. I hadn't seen him earlier. Roger and the PANA group have a very proud record of defending Irish neutrality. The Minister for State said we cannot rely on our geographic isolation for our security, and nobody is suggesting that or has ever suggested it to my mind. Our neutrality isn't just our greatest protection and defence, it's also our greatest weapon, to use that term, in terms of being able to play a positive and constructive role in the world. Being neutral doesn't mean that we're better than anybody else, but it means we're best placed to do particular things. And we have had a proud record of doing those things, and the triple lock underpins that. Regardless of whatever things have changed or circumstances have changed, one circumstance hasn't changed. It's when Micheál Martin said that the triple lock was a core component of Irish neutrality. He was right, and he cannot walk away from that. Now, Minister, the only argument it seems that the Department have handed you tonight is Russia, Russia, Russia. Did you ask them at all? Where is Russia currently preventing us sending soldiers to that we want to go? Have you asked that question? Because if you haven't, then I would suggest that you have come in here and read a prepared statement without any notion as to what it precisely means. Because you talk about valuing the UN Charter. The UN Charter is very clear. You cannot send troops abroad without a UN mandate. That's why it's called the UN Charter. And if you want to send troops abroad without a UN mandate, if you want to change the law, if you want to undermine the very basis of Irish neutrality, then you should at least be honest and upfront and saying that. The very fact that the Taoiseach has had to say that he might make it mandatory for Irish troops to serve in EU battle groups if they don't volunteer to do so just shows how out of scope and out of touch he is with our defence forces and with the wishes of the Irish people. Level of 2 ambition within the Commission of the Defence Forces sets out very clearly what's required in capital investment. This year, government undershot by 70 million. Our budget for next year undershot by 70 million. Hardly the sign of a government that's intent on building up our defence forces. 19 months ago, the report on the Commission of the Future of the Defence Forces identified the implementation of the Working Time Directive as the priority issue in order to address the retention and recruitment crisis within the Defence Forces. Where are we? Still not implemented. So this isn't about supporting our defence forces, and the language in the government's counter-motion pretending that you are supporting them rings very hollow, I have to say. Here's the core point in respect of foreign policy. When governments make decisions on foreign policy, it's not like domestic issues. It simply can't be just turned off on a whim. Sometimes decisions are so profound they can have implications for years to come, and that is particularly the case when it comes to participation in conflicts. One wrong decision by one minister, one government, could destroy decades of proud Irish tradition in terms of neutrality in an instant. And that's why we need a framework within the Constitution that actually sets out the basis on which governments can operate in terms of international conflicts. In our view, that framework should be based solely on the premise of being a force for conflict resolution as opposed to conflict participation. That's why we're willing to put that to the people and let them decide. And that would set the parameters by which future governments would operate. And if a government decided to be upfront and honest and said we want to send our troops somewhere outside of the scope of that, well then they could go back to the people and seek their support. But my guess is the Irish people have made it very clear. Can I finally make this point, please, Cahirlock? All the talk about sovereignty and the sovereign decisions of this House, I would gather a guess if each member of this House was asked about what we thought of the role of the Irish Defence Forces in the UNDOF UN peacekeeping mission in Golan Heights in Syria. The vast majority would say we are incredibly proud of that legacy. That legacy is coming to an end because of a decision by your government to withdraw them. And I think it is an absolute shame and a scandal. And I think it is a shame and a scandal that you didn't even reference it in your counter motion, because that's not at the behest of the Russians. That's not at the behest of the Chinese. That's at the behest of a failed Fianna Fáil party that are in government, overseeing the decimation of our defence forces and now seeking to destroy what's left of Irish neutrality.
Thank you. So the question is that the amendment to the amendment be made. Na teachtaí atá Havan Ceiste Aberdís Tá. Na teachtaí atá Gine Aberdís Níl. Sílam go bhfuil an ceist ritse. The division on PBP Solidarity's amendment to the Taoiseach's amendment is postponed until the weekly division time tomorrow evening.